Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, Jackson, Austin, and I will be discussing the data privacy investment landscape. So I'm Morgan. I'll start us off. I work at In-Q-Tel, which is the nonprofit strategic investor supporting the U.S. intelligence and national security community. Jackson represents Salesforce Ventures, and Austin represents Okta Ventures. Each of them will give a more in-depth intro as they launch into their slides later in the presentation. So kicking us off with this figure from Crunchbase, which shows the amount invested in privacy and security companies broken down by stage over the last 10 years. So here we can see close to $10 billion was invested in these companies in 2019. The takeaway here is that the market is becoming increasingly important for consumers and enterprises alike, the data privacy and security market. So here in our next slide, we launch into the high-level regulatory landscape and a sampling and overview of startup activity within each of these regions. So we'll start with Europe. GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, was rolled out in May 2018. It addresses the transfer of personal data inside and outside of the European Union. It was a really important and far-reaching regulation. And in terms of startup activity, Europe has a lot going on. Germany specifically seems to be a hub of data privacy activity, likely due to a high concentration of research universities in the country. Moving over to the US. So the US has no overarching federal data privacy law, but it has lots of industry-specific protections like HIPAA for healthcare and the California Consumer Privacy Act, which helps enhance privacy rights for consumer protections for residents of California. And CCPA, the act that I just mentioned, went into effect in January 2020. Similar to Europe, the US has a ton of startup activity and is home to key researchers and key research institutions in the data privacy space. So Harvard, Penn, and a few other institutions are really innovators in data privacy. Lastly, we have this bucket for what we just call rest of world, and I'll touch on a few specific geographies. There's a lot going on in data protection as different countries and consumers themselves are realizing how important data privacy is. So first we'll touch on Brazil. Brazil's regulation is called the General Data Protection Law. It's very similar to GDPR, and this was passed in August 2018. It focuses on personal data protection. In Canada, like in Europe, there is strong federal legislation in the data privacy space. Canada's main regulation is called the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. So this is key in Canada and covers how businesses handle personal information. And in terms of startup activity, it's pretty modest. China also has some privacy laws. The key one to know is China's cybersecurity law, which went into effect in June 2017. The law is the baseline for China's present-day guidelines. Great. So moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to level set by talking through some of the privacy-preserving technologies that exist in research and on the market today. So many of the startups on the previous slide are working with one or more of these methods to develop their products and their technologies. All of these approaches suit slightly different use cases and have slightly different drawbacks and limitations. So the key takeaway here is that there's often no one good answer when it comes to privacy protection. Sometimes you'll have to use different tools and different implementations based on what method suits your use case. So quickly, just to go through all of these, homomorphic encryption, we had Onveil on the previous slide, which is a company in this space. So homomorphic encryption enables compute on data without decryption. So what that means is it's able to keep information secure and accessible for analytic purposes. So for example, if you wanted to analyze medical records but ensure that data was not leaked, you could use homomorphic encryption. The limitation here is that it is slow with regard to computation time, though computation time is improving. So another technique that has a similar limitation, secure multi-party computation, which is just below, can also be computationally intensive. So what it does, it enables joint computation of a function, but it keeps the inputs private. So a use case here is aggregating data from many different sources while protecting the privacy of each different source. So we'll go back across the top here and look at differential privacy. This is a really interesting technique that provides anonymization with guarantees. Differential privacy uses an epsilon value that determines how strict privacy is. So I wanted to dive into a little bit deeper of an example here, and we'll take the 2020 census. So differential privacy is actually being used as a privacy-preserving measure in the 2020 census. The Census Bureau has a requirement to ensure that data from individuals and households remain confidential. So for the census this year, it plans to use differential privacy for disclosure avoidance. Basically, how it will work is some noise will be injected into the data to minimize risk of identity disclosure, but also preserve the potential for downstream calculations. So moving to federated learning, this is a distributed machine learning approach. You can train your models using decentralized data that reside on different end devices, such as cell phones. The use case is, in the case of cell phones, you can take them at different locations and they can, in a collaborative fashion, learn a machine learning model while keeping all personal data on device. Finally, I want to move down to synthetic data. So synthetic data is generated data that can be used in a number of different applications, but specifically for the purposes of this presentation, in a privacy-preserving context, users can generate training data where there is a limited amount of raw data. And in machine learning, for example, synthetic data can produce meaningful results for building and training privacy-preserving models. So lots of exciting things happening in this space. As you can see, this was just intended to be a brief overview. I'm going to turn it over to Jackson, who can talk a little bit more about enterprise applications and one of his portfolio companies that's actually using synthetic data. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. As she mentioned, my name is Jackson Cummings, and I'm an investor at Salesforce Ventures, which is Salesforce's strategic corporate venture fund, and our core focus is investing in leading enterprise software businesses globally. We've been investing for more than 10 years and have north of 250 active portfolio companies. And want to give a little bit of insights as to why privacy matters into the enterprise. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that now more than ever, enterprises are really paying attention to data privacy and these various regulations that Morgan mentioned. And part of that is the scope of these regulations is massive. More than 1 billion people today globally are now free to exercise their subject rights at no cost to them. This affects both consumer businesses as well as B2B enterprises collecting this sensitive information. As we move down into some of the key trends that we're hearing from our end customers, we spend a lot of time talking to folks in the space and customers, companies, and to pinpoint what these key trends and pain points that they're seeing within their own organizations. And one of the key trends we're seeing is that this is becoming more and more important to C-suites, and that data privacy is no longer siloed with the security or IT teams inside of these companies. Due to data breaches and fines, the level of importance has escalated to the entire C-suite. We are seeing trends that every C-level individual, including the CMO and the chief product officer, need to understand the ramifications of data privacy and how it affects their organizations. We do recognize that budgets have been constrained in the near term, primarily due to COVID-19, but in the long term, our view is that, and what we have heard is that budgets related to data privacy will increase. Another key theme here is that customer is king. Customers remain important for every business, and a data breach will negatively impact the relationship that these enterprises have with their customers. Every data breach, including some of the high-profile cases that we've seen from Equifax and from Facebook, are proving negatively impactful for these companies and run the risk of losing trust with their end customers as well as brand appeal with their customer bases. Another key theme here is that fines from these regulations are increasing. So since GDPR was issued roughly 24 months ago, regulatory bodies have been gradually getting more harsh on companies, especially those that have not proven an effort to become compliant. The risk associated here in a class action lawsuit are continuing to increase, and we're seeing these fines be more and more imperative to companies today. Now, touching on a couple of the applications that are solving some of these pain points below are, and as I mentioned here at Salesforce Ventures, we have made a number of investments in the space, and these are a few of our portfolio companies that are within the data privacy realm. Wanted to highlight just a couple here. And firstly, Big ID is a market-leading data discovery and mapping organization that is focused on surfacing PII for both unstructured as well as structured data within an organization's network. They allow an organization to map out where they have vulnerabilities and help them stay compliant, among a number of other things. Another company to highlight here is Privitar, and they've built an industry-leading product allowing organizations to use, share, and derive insights from data safely. To touch on, this is the company that Morgan highlighted earlier when she mentioned synthetic data. So they use synthetic data to generate dates, numbers, text, and even credit card numbers to generate this additional data to use. They're also able to tokenize and de-identify this data, especially when it's data associated with PII. So in transition here, these are just a few solutions that enterprises are using to better tackle these pain points that they're facing related to data privacy. And now I want to kick it over to Austin to talk you through some of the trends he's seeing from the consumer standpoint.
Thanks, Jackson. As we saw in the previous two sections of this presentation, Morgan helped establish a lot of the government regulations and technology drivers that are sparking interest among VCs. And Jackson talked about how the enterprise is particularly interested in solving for numerous problems that are both spurred by regulation and also specific needs within companies. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the consumer drive that's happening right now and how the sentiment has changed over the past 10 years towards more privacy-preserving technologies and consumer use cases. So if we just take a little bit of a chronological look at some of the key marquee technologies that have happened in consumer over the past few years, we really saw the advent of social media and social networks launch with Facebook. And at the time when it was first adopted, we started to see a lot of people sharing different posts and social media posts widely to the public. And over time, obviously, people started to realize that they wanted to have additional settings to perhaps just post the social media excerpt or picture to a particular person or a group. And really, a few years after some of those privacy settings were enabled on Facebook, we started to see a lot of interest in the messaging platforms. This coincided, obviously, with the advent of the iPhone and really the rise of mobile devices amongst consumers that were internet-enabled. And that's really when we started to see WhatsApp begin its inexorable rise. And obviously, Facebook acquired WhatsApp. And largely, the perspective that I'd like to share here is we think that's really a drive towards moving away from a public persona of using social media towards more of a closed, enclosed environment where you can share information, pictures, and messaging with your groups. That also led, around the time of when Snap was established, to this idea of ephemeral messaging. So sending a message that can disappear. And it's no surprise that, some of the younger folks, people in their teens that are doing maybe different activities with their friends, that they are actually the first people that really want to have a chance to have that privacy-preserving technology. And that really led to other tools like Signal and Telegram, and even smaller communities like Keybase that were, from an encryption technology standpoint, much more enhanced than other social networks that we've seen in the past. Obviously, Zoom just acquired Keybase recently and was really a good symbol of a large enterprise company looking towards consumer technology as a way to innovate and improve its encryption and privacy-preserving technology for its user base. And now there's even newer companies that are coming online right now. Planetary is an example of an early startup, which is building a social network from the ground up with privacy preservation as a core founding principle. So over time, we've really seen two major strains. We've seen a move from more public distribution of information from the consumer to an interest to closing towards specific groups. And we're also seeing enterprise companies finding inspiration from some of these consumer technologies really around tools of encryption and privacy mechanisms. So with that, we wanted to transfer, the organizers of OpenMined asked us if we could provide a kind of crystal ball slide at the end of this presentation. And so each of us have derived a specific recommendation or prediction, I should say. And so I'll hand it off to Morgan. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you think the future holds, or what the future holds for this industry.
Definitely. Thanks, Austin. So here I just wanted to share, I think the privacy by design paradigm is becoming increasingly important, and OpenMined definitely plays a huge role in that, as privacy tools are made available open source, and developers continue to build privacy into their products from the first step in the development life cycle. So I think that paradigm will become increasingly important as we move forward, and I'll turn it over to Jackson to share his recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan, and thanks, Austin here. I guess in terms of the crystal ball here, I guess enterprises and consumer spaces alike are seeing privacy innovation. That's no real big surprises, but at the end of the day, the space was not well defined and is now part of the enterprise tech stack. Meaning this is a C-level decision, and there are big budgets and big corporate governance associated with this specific space. And I think another thing to highlight, if we take a look at some of our portfolio companies and most of the companies that are being created here in the space, none of them really existed 10 years ago. And these are companies that are now big in raising a ton of funding. And we do feel that this is just the first inning and where data privacy is going to go. So in terms of, kind of the next generation, we still think that there's a lot of innovation to be had and a lot of corporate budgets that are looking to push into this space. And with that, I will shoot it over to Austin.
Yeah, thanks, Jackson. I would say that in consumer, what we're seeing is really a trend towards valuing privacy in a way that hasn't been done in the past. Again, historically, the advent of social media and social networks really brought on this idea of sharing your posts publicly, of creating a very wide following. But we've begun to see a real emergence of messaging platforms, very sophisticated encryption technologies being utilized for those messaging platforms that can be particularly useful when talking about sensitive topics. And these hardcore technologies are now being adopted in the consumer sphere. And it really is interesting to see the rise of consumers thinking about their security almost like an enterprise security company. And so that's been a really exciting area to look at. And I think we're just going to see a lot more of that as the sophistication of the consumer grows over time. So with that, we just wanted to offer the chance for you all to ask anything. We have recorded this presentation, but we will be available to actually answer your questions when this is posted live. So thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.